Just a very short lecture on parameter groups. So I talked about them, but basically you can configure your entire DB engine, as we'll see, using parameter groups. And if it's a dynamic parameter, it can be applied immediately, but if it's a static parameter, then it will only be applied after you reboot your instance, so that when the instance reboots, basically, it just picks up these parameters. We can also modify the parameter group associated with the DB, so we can replace the default one by our custom one, but for this, we'll also must reboot our database. And to know all the parameters available for a specific DB technology, you can look at the documentation or as well use the AWS console, as we'll see in a second. Now there's one must-know parameter you need to know for the exam, and that's the one called, for Postgres and SQL Server, RDS.force_SSL equals 1. And that's the way to enforce SSL connection to a Postgres or SQL Server database. You must know this parameter going into the exam. But as a reminder, it doesn't work for MySQL. For MySQL or MariaDB, you must run a SQL statement called grant select on database.star/2, and then you just at the end say require SSL. So it's pretty funky that there's two different ways of doing it, but that's the way it is. So for Postgres, you can use a parameter group, but for MySQL, it's a SQL statement. Remember this going into the exam. Now let's just have a quick look at parameter groups in the console. So parameter groups are accessible from the left-hand side panel. And as you can see, when we create a database, it creates a default parameter groups for us. And we could click on it and see anything, but we won't be able to change this group. In this parameters filter, you can just type any parameters and see how it is. We'll create our own parameter group, so I'll call it a parameter group, and I need to select my database instance. So for me, it's going to be Postgres 10, because we use 10.4. The group name is I'll call it group demo Postgres. And I'll just call it demo group for Postgres. You have to put a description in. Click on create. And here I'm basically able in this group to change any of my parameters to whatever I want. So as you can see, we can change the authentication timeout to whatever value we wanted. If we click on it and click on edit parameters, then you're literally able to change the value you want for anything. But so the one parameter that I want you to look at is going to be called force_SSL. And as you can see, RDS.force_SSL is here. It's a dynamic type of parameter, so we won't need to reboot our instance. And it's a Boolean, and this is to force SSL connections. So I can just click on it, edit the parameters, and say 1. And this will force my database to have SSL connections only. So this is how I force encryption for Postgres. Okay, I saved it. So now my parameter group has been saved. And let's see if that works. So I'll just refresh my page. And then after refreshing my page, I'm going to type force_SSL again. Okay, now the value is 1, so it means it's enabled. So now what I can do is assign this parameter group to my Postgres database. So what I want to do is take this parameter group, which by the way, I can edit, copy, compare, reset, or delete. I want to assign it to my database. So I'll go to my database and I'll click on it and I'll modify it. And within it, I can now assign my parameter group. So let's scroll down. And in there, I will have here the DB parameter group, and I will say it's group demo Postgres. Because I changed the parameter group, I will have to reboot my instance. So I'm fine. Everything else, I'll leave the same. I'll click on continue and then modify DB instance, but I will apply immediately instead of applying during the next scheduled maintenance window. So I'll do this right now, modify DB instance. And now my instance is going to be restarting and rebooting using this new parameter group, but this time it will basically have forced SSL connections, which is what I wanted. So after a few reboots, it turns out that if you scroll down, you see that the parameter group is group demo Postgres, and now it's in sync and now it's using all the parameters I have specified. So that's it for this lecture. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next lecture.